The first time Graham saw Calvin backstage, it didn't feel like a meeting. It felt like timing, like the theater had decided to rearrange the universe by a few inches and see whether they would notice. The community theater smelled like old paint, dust caught in stage lights, and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. Every sound traveled strangely in the building. Footsteps in the hallway turned into soft thunder, and laughter behind a curtain sounded half-swallowed, like it wasn't meant to reach the parts of the room that still held silence. Graham arrived early that afternoon because he'd said yes to too many tasks and always tried to outrun his own doubt. He was the set designer for a production that needed help more than it needed pride, and he'd promised himself he'd do it right. Every brace, every painted wall segment, every little detail that made the audience believe in a world that existed only for 90 minutes. Calvin was on the floor near the props table, kneeling with a lamp clamped to a workbench. He wasn't loud. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He had a careful way of moving, like he was handling something fragile even if it looked like metal. When Graham stepped closer, he saw that Calvin was fixing a broken hinge on a painted door prop. The hinge had cracked in rehearsal the week before. It should have been a quick fix, something Graham could have done himself, but Graham hadn't been in the room when it happened. Now, watching Calvin work, Graham felt the weird, involuntary respect that came from seeing someone treat the smallest problem like it mattered. Graham cleared his throat. "You know you don't have to do it right now?" Calvin glanced up. His face didn't brighten right away. Instead, his expression shifted carefully, like he had to decide what version of himself was safest. "It's better if it's done before the next rehearsal. Otherwise, someone will trip over it and we'll all pretend we're fine." Graham smiled, but it was the kind of smile that stayed close to the surface. "You've got that caretaker energy." Calvin huffed a laugh, quiet and almost embarrassed. "I've got anxiety energy, same thing." They looked at each other for a moment longer than conversation required. Graham told himself it was nothing. He told himself theater people often made eye contact longer than strangers did. It was bonding. It was community. It was shared stress. But something in Graham's chest tightened, not painfully, just like a string being pulled. Like his body had noticed something before his mind had permission to name it. Calvin went back to the hinge, hands steady. "You're Graham, right?" Graham blinked. "Yeah. I've watched you plan the sets," Calvin said. "You stand there like you're listening to the play even when the actors aren't on stage." Graham felt heat rise in his neck. "That's a flattering way to say I'm nervous." Calvin's mouth softened, and for a second Graham saw something open behind his eyes, something that didn't feel guarded. "I think nervous is better than careless." Graham didn't know what to do with that. He nodded like it was a normal comment, and then he started talking about measurements. It was easy to hide in numbers, easy to pretend the conversation was about wood and nails instead of the quiet electricity of being seen. They worked in parallel. Graham adjusted a piece of trim while Calvin tightened screws that barely resisted. When Graham needed more light, Calvin moved the lamp without being asked. When Calvin paused to check alignment, Graham leaned in and pointed out what he'd noticed. Their shoulders were close enough that Graham could smell Calvin's soap, something clean and slightly herbal, and the warmth of Calvin's body seeped into the space between them. Graham told himself it was just proximity. Backstage closeness happened all the time. People had to stand near each other to lift things, pass items, fix emergencies. But as the afternoon slipped into evening, Graham realized the closeness was staying. It wasn't only physical, it was something else. They didn't flirt out loud. There wasn't a joke that landed too hard, or a compliment that lingered like bait. It was quieter than that. It was the way Calvin looked at Graham when Graham asked for input, the way Calvin didn't rush away when Graham's hand brushed his, once, accidentally, reaching for the same bottle of wood glue. For a breath, both men froze. Graham's heartbeat came too loudly to his own ears. Calvin's eyes flicked to Graham's mouth and back to his eyes, like he'd caught himself thinking something he was not supposed to think. Then Calvin pulled away first. Not abruptly, just with the practiced caution of someone who'd learned where desire could become a problem. Graham let himself swallow it. "Thanks," he said, voice too steady. Calvin nodded. "Any time." That should have been the end of it. A moment, an accident, back to work. But the theater, the way it held people together through rehearsals and deadlines, made it impossible to pretend the moment had never existed. On opening week Tuesday, the production's music director asked if anyone could help with a last-minute audition cut. The lead actor needed a replacement section for a song, and the only person who'd been free was Calvin. Calvin had been volunteering for years, Graham had heard. He fixed lights, adjusted costumes, handled sound issues when the tech team couldn't. He was reliable in the way some people were reliable because they feared being rejected. The music director, Marcel, who ran the show from behind a clipboard, stood near the stage entrance. "We need someone who can hold a note and doesn't get lost in the track changes. Calvin, you're the only one who's done this before." Calvin's shoulders tensed. "I can try." Marcel arched an eyebrow. "That's not an answer. That's fear. Try means you're willing." Graham watched the exchange from a distance, then couldn't help it. He stepped closer. "It's a song cut, right? How long?" Calvin glanced at him, and that careful version of him returned, the one that kept walls up. 2 minutes. Graham nodded. "You'll be fine. 2 minutes in a room full of people is like maybe 8 years, but you'll still be fine." Calvin's lips twitched. "You talk like you're trying to outsmart the nerves." Graham shrugged, but his stomach twisted. "I talk like that because it works." Marcel tapped his clipboard against his palm. "Okay, everyone hush. We'll run it backstage first, then stage." They set a small speaker near the props, and the track played, tinny at first. Graham stayed quiet, but he could tell Calvin's voice came from somewhere deeper than rehearsal. Calvin stepped into the song like he'd been carrying it around in his body for a long time. And then, because theater was cruel and unpredictable, Calvin got it wrong on the first line. The music director stopped him, not harsh but blunt. "No, reset. That line belongs on the downbeat. You're early." Calvin's face tightened. Graham saw the flicker of humiliation. It wasn't because Calvin couldn't sing. It was because Calvin hated being corrected in front of people. Marcel's tone softened a fraction. "Try again." Calvin exhaled, then nodded. He reset, and this time his voice found the downbeat like it was searching for it. When he finished, the room went quiet in a way that felt like everyone was listening past the song. Graham's throat ached with an emotion he didn't know how to name. It wasn't only admiration, it was the recognition that Calvin was capable of giving something real, and that Graham wasn't sure he wanted to witness it and risk wanting more. After the run, when everyone dispersed, Calvin stood alone near the hallway, holding his lyric sheet like it might break if he let go. Graham approached slowly, giving him space while still not abandoning him. "You did it," Graham said. Calvin's eyes lifted. "It's always weird when people think you can do something. Like, where did that come from?" Graham leaned his shoulder against the wall. It felt cold through his shirt. "I think you have more than people realize." Calvin's gaze shifted to Graham's hands. "You always notice everything." Graham swallowed. "Maybe I'm just paying attention." Calvin's voice dropped. "Attention can get dangerous." Graham felt the sentence land in his chest like a warning shot. "Why?" he asked, careful. "Because of the show? Or because of you?" Calvin's eyes flinched. The question had forced something into the open. He looked away, and Graham could see the calculation behind his expressions. Calvin was deciding whether honesty would cost him everything. "It's not the show," Calvin said finally. Graham didn't speak. He didn't want to push. He also didn't want to let the moment become one more secret that lived between them. Calvin's fingers tightened around the paper. "You're gonna think I'm something." Graham's stomach dropped, not with fear of the word something, but with fear of how close it might be to the truth. "I already think you're someone," he said quietly. "You're you. That's not the same as—" Calvin cut in. "No, you don't understand. People have expectations. They want their stories clean. They want a straight line between who you are and who you're supposed to want. Graham stared at him, confused and unsettled. Straight line? Calvin's mouth tightened. The way he looked at Graham, like he wanted to confess and punish himself at the same time, made Graham's breath catch. I used to be the kind of man people talked about like it was easy, Calvin said. The sentence hung there. Graham felt the theater around them continue moving. Someone laughing far away, the hum of fluorescent lights, the faint echo of footsteps. Calvin's voice grew quieter. A long time ago, I told myself I was fine with what everyone expected. I told myself that if I did the right things, if I stayed busy, if I acted normal, then wanting would behave. Graham's heart hammered. He didn't ask for details. He didn't know if he deserved them. Calvin looked down at his hands. I didn't lie because I wanted to hurt anyone. I lied because I didn't know how to be honest with my own body. Because once you realize something, it changes the way the world feels. Graham's eyes stung unexpectedly. There was so much he could say. That Calvin didn't owe anyone a label, that honesty mattered, that Graham didn't want clean stories. Instead, Graham asked the only question that mattered in that moment. What changed? Calvin's lips parted, but no sound came out. Then Marcel's voice floated down the hallway, calling for Calvin to check the stage lights. Calvin! We're about to lock positions. The interruption was almost merciful. It gave Graham and Calvin a way to step out of the cliff's edge without falling. Calvin nodded quickly, paper still in his hands. I'll be right there. But before he walked away, Calvin turned back. You should be careful, he said. Not with me, with what you feel when I'm around. Graham's voice came out rough. Why? Calvin looked at him for a beat too long. Because I don't know if I can stop it. Then Calvin left. Graham stood in the hallway, staring at the wall like it might provide an answer. He wanted to believe the words were only nerves, only theater talk. He wanted to believe Calvin would go back to being just reliable, just helpful, just a man Graham could admire without being implicated. But the sentences replayed in Graham's head all night. Attention can get dangerous. You should be careful. I don't know if I can stop it. On Wednesday, rehearsal ran longer than expected. Graham stayed late because the set needed adjustments after actors shifted their blocking. He worked until his shoulders burned and his eyes felt sandy. When he finally looked up, the stage lights were dimmed. The building was almost empty, except for the soft shuffle of someone collecting props. Graham turned and saw Calvin at the far end of the room, gathering costumes from a chair. The stage curtains were partially closed, like the theater was trying to keep its own secrets. Graham approached slowly. You're still here. Calvin glanced up. I was hoping you'd notice I was working. Otherwise, you might think I was avoiding you. Graham's breath caught. Why would I think that? Calvin's jaw worked. Because you always look like you want to say something. Graham froze. Maybe I do. Calvin stepped closer, stopping at a distance that made Graham's skin vibrate with tension. The air between them smelled like fabric and fresh paint. Calvin's voice dropped. You don't ask questions when you want answers, he said. Graham swallowed. I'm trying not to ruin things. Calvin let out a breath that sounded like frustration and relief tangled together. What things? Graham couldn't answer, not with words that didn't betray him. Calvin took another step forward. Graham didn't move. He let Calvin decide how close they got. Calvin's hands hovered near Graham's sides, not touching yet, as if he was asking permission without using language. Graham's pulse thudded in his throat. He wanted to lean into the closeness. He also wanted to be good. He wanted to be safe. He heard himself say very quietly, Are you running from something? Calvin's eyes glistened under the stage lights. I'm running from being known, he admitted. Graham felt tears gather, angry at how easily they came. Known isn't a bad thing. Calvin looked at him with a kind of pain that didn't ask for pity. It demanded courage. Known can destroy people, Calvin said. Graham's voice shook. Then don't destroy yourself. Let me be part of it. Calvin's expression changed. For the first time, his guardedness cracked enough for honesty to show. "I've been rehearsing a different life in my head," Calvin said. "A version where I never had to want. A version where I could walk through the world like it didn't touch me." Graham's chest tightened. "And what happened?" Calvin swallowed. "I met you, or rather, you kept showing up in the moments where my brain wanted to lie." The sentence wasn't romantic the way movies were romantic. It was raw and specific, full of the truth of how desire had slipped through Graham's presence. Graham whispered, "I didn't mean to." Calvin's mouth trembled. "I know. That's the problem. You didn't. You didn't do it on purpose. You didn't try to get me. You just existed. And suddenly I couldn't pretend I didn't notice." Graham's hand rose, slow as a prayer. He reached for Calvin's wrist. Calvin didn't pull away. Their fingers interlaced, warm and real. For a second, Graham thought he would feel satisfaction, some kind of triumphant relief. Instead, he felt fear so sharp it almost made him dizzy. Calvin's secret wasn't only about attraction, it was about consequences. "What's the thing you can't tell me?" Graham asked. Calvin's thumb stroked Graham's knuckles once, like a grounding gesture. "Not here." Graham didn't understand, but his body did. The theater felt like a witness. Every wall had ears, every prop had memories. So Graham nodded and squeezed Calvin's hand once. "Then when?" Calvin's gaze moved over Graham's face like he was searching for the part that could survive an answer. "Tonight," he said, then immediately shook his head as if the word frightened him. "Or tomorrow, I don't know. I just know I can't keep doing this halfway." Graham's breath hitched. "Doing what?" Calvin looked away, and when he looked back, his eyes were wet. "Letting you think I'm safe when I'm not." The confession made something in Graham go quiet. The theater suddenly felt colder, like the building was bracing itself for impact. Graham leaned closer. "I don't need you safe," he said. "I need you honest." Calvin's throat moved. "Honest hurts." Graham's voice broke. "So does pretending." Silence stretched, thick enough to touch. Then Calvin stepped even closer and finally pressed his forehead gently against Graham's. Their breaths mingled, careful at first. Graham had expected the moment to feel like a turning point. Instead, it felt like a question. Calvin whispered, barely audible, "Are you sure?" Graham's answer came out in a breath. "I'm sure I don't want to watch you disappear." Calvin's hands cupped Graham's cheeks. The touch was warm and trembling, like Calvin was trying to memorize Graham without knowing if he'd get the chance. Graham expected a kiss to solve everything, but Calvin hesitated, not because he was unwilling, because he was afraid that if he kissed Graham, the secret would have to come out immediately, and Calvin didn't know whether honesty would protect them or destroy them. Graham felt the decision happening in Calvin's silence. Then Calvin kissed him, slow, careful, like he was stepping across a line that could change the ground. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fireworks feeling. It was softer than that, but it hit deeper than fireworks could. Graham tasted the faint coffee on Calvin's breath and the sweetness of something that wasn't candy, just the nerves of a man who'd waited too long. When Calvin pulled back, their foreheads stayed together. Graham whispered, "That's not fair." Calvin's eyes widened slightly. "What isn't?" "This," Graham said, gesturing between them with trembling fingers. "Making me want you and then acting like you have to disappear." Calvin's expression folded. "I'm trying to figure out how to stay without lying." Graham's heart ached. "Then stay." Calvin closed his eyes briefly. "I can't stay the way you want yet." Graham swallowed down panic. "Then tell me what you're afraid of. Give me the truth." Calvin's eyes opened. The stage lights made them look almost gold. "If I tell you, I risk losing you before you even decide you want to keep me." Graham stared at him. "You already have me deciding. You don't get to pretend you didn't." Calvin let out a shaky laugh with no humor. "I've been straight in front of everyone," he said, voice cracking at the word straight like it had sharp edges. "I've been playing the role so long I forgot there was another option. I forgot my own desire could be real without being a scandal." Graham didn't interrupt. He didn't correct the language. He let Calvin say what he needed to say. Calvin's voice grew quieter. But there's someone. Not you, someone else. Someone who thinks they know me. Graham's stomach turned. Are you in a relationship? Calvin flinched. No, not the way people mean it. Graham's eyes narrowed, pain rising. Then what? Calvin looked away, and Graham saw the shame underneath the fear. Shame didn't come from guilt alone. It came from realizing you'd let a lie grow roots. I have a partner, Calvin finally said. Graham's heart fell so hard he felt it in his hands. You... He couldn't finish the sentence. Calvin rushed on, voice urgent. Not like a boyfriend, not like you're imagining, not like something romantic and cruel. It's complicated. He's not... Graham's breathing got shallow. The theater felt too bright, too exposed. Calvin's eyes searched Graham's face. He's someone I took care of when he was sick. He asked for comfort. He asked for stability. And I told myself it was just kindness. Graham stared. And now? Calvin swallowed. And now I don't know how to untangle it without making him feel abandoned. I don't know how to say I can't keep playing that role and also keep you. Graham felt anger, but it wasn't the clean anger he expected. It was tangled with grief, because Graham had already given part of himself. He'd already kissed Calvin back. He'd already wanted to protect him. And now Calvin was telling him the truth. The secret wasn't only identity. It was obligation. Graham whispered, "You're afraid you'll be the villain." Calvin nodded. Tears spilled from the corners of his eyes. Yes, I'm afraid you'll look at me and only see a man who took something he didn't deserve. Graham's voice shook. I'm not the judge, he said. I'm the person who's here. Calvin looked at him like those words were a miracle. Graham stepped closer again, closing the distance with his body this time. But I can't be your secret, too, Graham said. Calvin's breath hitched. You won't be. Graham almost laughed at the desperation in Calvin's voice. Promise me you won't lie to me. Calvin's hands cupped Graham's face again, as if Graham was something fragile that could shatter if held wrong. I promise I'll tell you everything I can. And when I can't, I'll tell you why. The tenderness in Calvin's words made Graham's throat tighten. He leaned in and pressed his lips to Calvin's again, gentle, not demanding, as if he was reminding Calvin that wanting wasn't betrayal. Then Graham pulled back, forehead to forehead. We need to talk without the theater watching, he said. Calvin nodded slowly. My place is close, not far. Graham's stomach twisted at the word place. It sounded like a decision. But the truth already existed between them. The stage lights didn't have to be the only witnesses. Okay, Graham said, voice barely there, but you tell me the full truth tonight, even if it hurts. Calvin's eyes fluttered. I will. They didn't rush. They walked through the theater's side hallway together, keeping their hands close without gripping too hard. Each step felt like balancing on something thin. When they reached the parking lot, the night air hit Graham's skin, cooling the heat of the rehearsal room. The sky looked washed out, like it couldn't decide whether to be dark or gray. Calvin opened his car door and gestured for Graham to get in first. Graham hesitated, then climbed into the passenger seat. Calvin walked around the car and sat behind the wheel. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he stared at the dashboard like he was trying to read what would happen next. Graham looked at him and realized Calvin had gone quiet in a way that wasn't just nervousness. It was fear of being found out. Graham asked gently, "What's the full truth?" Calvin swallowed. "It's not just the person," he said. "It's the way I've built my life around the lie." Graham's voice softened. "You don't have to be perfect to be honest." Calvin exhaled. "I know, but honesty requires I stop protecting everyone else before I protect myself." Graham closed his eyes for a second, letting that sentence settle. Then he opened them and looked at Calvin. "Then start now." Calvin turned the key. The engine turned over with a low rumble. The car rolled forward. The road was quiet. Streetlights moved across Graham's face like slow, shifting shadows. Calvin spoke at red lights, then paused at green lights, then spoke again when the road opened. Graham listened, every word carving out a picture he didn't want to live inside. Calvin told him about the man he'd cared for, the routine of pills and appointments, the way Calvin had offered help because it was easier than admitting loneliness. He told him about the guilt that had turned into habit, and how habit had turned into a cage. He also told Graham something that made the night feel more dangerous. Calvin had agreed to keep the man's caregiving arrangement in place longer than he intended, not because he still wanted to give, but because he was afraid of the backlash he'd get when he stopped. Graham's chest tightened. He wanted to be kind. He wanted to understand. But he also needed to feel that Calvin had agency. When they finally arrived at Calvin's apartment building, the hallway light flickered. It made Calvin's face look ghostly, like he wasn't sure he belonged in his own skin. They entered quietly. The apartment smelled faintly of detergent and something warm, candle or incense, Graham couldn't tell. There were books stacked neatly, even though the place looked like it had been lived in by a man who stayed busy. Calvin led Graham to the kitchen table. Graham sat first. He didn't ask to sit. It felt like they both knew that the table was where people said the truth when they didn't have the courage to say it while standing. Calvin remained standing for a long time. His hands were clasped so tightly Graham could see the strain in the tendons. Graham tried to breathe slowly. He waited without pretending it didn't hurt. Calvin finally sat across from him. "I need you to understand," Calvin said, voice low. "When I say I've been straight, I mean it literally. I performed it. I participated in it. I made promises I didn't check for whether they were true." Graham's jaw clenched. "Promises to who?" Calvin flinched. "To him. To my friends. To my father. To the version of me that existed before you." Graham's heart pounded with grief that didn't have a clean outlet. Calvin's eyes lifted. "I thought I could love him the way people expect men to love women. I thought if I held someone's life together, then the part of me that wanted something else would shrink." Graham's voice came out quiet. "It didn't shrink." Calvin shook his head, tears sliding down his cheeks now without restraint. "It got louder." Graham's throat tightened. "And you didn't tell me because you thought you'd lose me." Calvin's laugh was broken. "Yes, and because I didn't know if you'd still look at me the same way." Graham stared at him. "How do I look at you?" Calvin's lips parted. "Like I'm a man you can't afford to ruin." Graham blinked hard. "I don't want to ruin you," he said. "I want to save you from the lie." Calvin's eyes softened with something like relief. "Then what do we do?" Graham felt the answer in his bones. They couldn't undo the past, but they could stop feeding the lie. "We start with truth," Graham said. "Not just about your secret, about what you want from me." Calvin swallowed. "I want you." The words were simple, but they landed like a door opening into cold air. Graham's chest squeezed. "And what about him?" Calvin's eyes filled again. "I'll end the arrangement properly. I'll tell him the truth. I'll stop hiding behind paperwork and routine. I'll help him find a different way to get care. I won't disappear. I won't let him believe I'm still pretending I'm straight." Graham's breath shook. "That's going to hurt." Calvin nodded. "Everything honest hurts." Graham reached across the table and touched Calvin's hand. This time Calvin didn't flinch. He held on. Graham whispered, "I can handle hurt. I can't handle lies." Calvin squeezed Graham's fingers. "Then I won't lie to you." They sat in silence while the building settled around them. Somewhere in the distance, a car door shut. A neighbor's footsteps faded. The quiet wasn't empty. It felt like the space between two people deciding whether they deserved peace. Graham eventually exhaled. "I don't want to be a rebound." Calvin's face tightened. "You're not." Graham watched him closely. "You're not using me to escape guilt." Calvin's voice broke. "No! I'm using you to find myself, to stop running in circles." Graham nodded slowly. "Then we take it one step at a time." Calvin's eyes flickered with hope that looked painful to accept. "Okay," Calvin whispered. One step. Graham leaned forward and kissed Calvin again, but this kiss had a different temperature. Less adrenaline, more commitment. Calvin's hand slid to Graham's waist, careful, like he was learning where Graham's boundaries were. Graham didn't pull away. He didn't ask for speed. When they finally separated, Calvin rested his forehead against Graham's shoulder for a moment. It wasn't dramatic. It was a man exhausted from holding up a lie. Graham felt the tremor in Calvin's breath and understood that honesty wasn't only a confession. It was a surrender. Later, after they talked through logistics and feelings, after Graham asked questions and Calvin answered them even when his voice cracked, they stood by the living room window. The city lights made halos on the glass. Graham asked, "What if he hates you?" Calvin leaned his head against the wall. "I think he will. I think he'll be hurt. But I can't be responsible for my fear. I can only be responsible for my choices." Graham felt tears gather again. "And if you lose people?" Calvin's eyes turned toward Graham, steady now. "Then I lose them." The certainty was frightening. It was the kind of courage Graham had always wanted to have. Graham swallowed. "I'm scared too," he admitted. Calvin looked surprised. "About what?" Graham let out a shaky laugh. "About being the reason you burn your life down. About becoming another chapter you regret." Calvin stepped closer. "Then I'll prove I'm not." Graham's chest tightened. "How?" Calvin reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened a notes app and then paused, glancing at Graham like he needed permission. "Would you—" Calvin started. Graham nodded. "Yeah." Calvin typed something, then showed the screen. It was a message draft to the man he'd been caring for, written carefully. Not cruel, not evasive, just honest and kind. Graham's throat closed. "You already started." Calvin's eyes were wet again. "I started when you kissed me in the theater." Graham stared at him, stunned. "So it wasn't just lust." Calvin's smile was small and broken. "It was never only lust." Graham felt the emotional complexity settle in his chest like a weight he could finally carry. They didn't announce anything. They didn't declare grand futures. They just sat together on the couch, legs touching, and talked until their voices grew hoarse. When Marcel appeared the next day, because theater demanded presence even when your heart needed privacy, Graham almost panicked. They met Marcel in the rehearsal room while opening night approached. Marcel looked between them and then back at Graham. "Are we good?" Marcel asked. Graham felt his face go hot. Calvin's hand brushed his knee, a silent check-in. Graham realized Marcel already knew something was different. In theater, people noticed everything. Marcel cleared his throat. "There's an issue with the publicity copy." Graham blinked. "What issue?" Marcel handed over a printed sheet. The copy included a bio about Calvin that assumed certain things. Assumptions about being single, assumptions about being straight in a way Calvin had never bothered to correct, because correcting it would mean admitting he'd been pretending. Graham's stomach tightened. He looked at Calvin. Calvin stared at the paper like it was a bomb he hadn't asked for. Marcel asked quietly, "You okay?" Calvin's voice came out flat. "No." Marcel frowned, concern sharpening. "Because of the copy?" Calvin hesitated, then nodded once. "Because of everything." Graham felt the thread pull between them again, the secret, the honesty, the cost. Calvin's eyes met Graham's. The look was permission and fear at the same time. Graham stood slowly. "I can talk to Marcel," he said. Marcel's eyebrows lifted. "You want to?" Graham nodded. "Yeah." Graham didn't lie. He didn't pretend this was a small problem. He stepped into honesty like it was a stage scene that demanded courage. He told Marcel that Calvin's bio had errors. He told Marcel that Calvin needed the copy corrected because Calvin wouldn't hide behind assumptions anymore. Marcel listened without interrupting. When Graham finished, Marcel exhaled slowly. "You're asking me to change the story," he said. Graham swallowed. "We're asking you to let him tell the truth." Marcel's gaze softened. "Okay," he said, voice careful. "I can do that." Graham blinked. "You can?" Marcel nodded once, then looked toward Calvin. But you need to promise me something. Nobody gets to use the theater as shelter if it's going to become a hiding place. Calvin's throat moved. I promise, he said. Marcel left to make the changes. When Marcel walked away, Graham turned to Calvin. You're scared. Calvin's eyes were glassy. I feel exposed. Graham stepped closer. Good, he whispered. Exposed is how healing happens. Calvin laughed, shaky. That's not what my body thinks. Graham touched Calvin's cheek. Then we teach your body a new truth, he said, slowly. The next rehearsal went differently. Calvin didn't sing like he was trying to impress anyone. He sang like he was releasing something. When actors hit the mark, Calvin adjusted the lighting with steady hands. He looked at Graham between takes, not in a secretive way, but in a way that said, I see you, and I'm not ashamed of wanting. Graham felt his own fear shift. It didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became courage instead of paralysis. Opening night arrived, and the community theater filled with people wearing their Sunday smiles and program-folded anticipation. The stage lights warmed everything. The curtains breathed. Backstage was chaos, disguised as teamwork. Someone yelled about costume timing. Someone spilled gaff tape remnants. Graham's hands flew over paint touch-ups and set anchors. Calvin moved beside him, close enough to share breath, far enough to not overwhelm. Marcel checked final cues. Graham, your stair landing needs one more strip of tape. Calvin, you're on standby for the mic pack. Graham nodded. He knelt to tape the stair landing. When he stood, his knees felt weak. Calvin reached for his elbow to steady him. Their hands lingered. Graham heard himself ask quietly, Did you message him yet? Calvin's face tightened. Not yet. Graham felt dread rise. Why not? Calvin's eyes flicked down to Graham's hands. Because I'm scared I'll send it and he'll say something that makes me regret everything. Graham swallowed. And if you wait until after opening night? Calvin didn't answer right away. Then he admitted, because I need to survive tonight first. Graham understood. He hated it, but he understood. Okay, Graham said, but you need to send it, not after the applause, after we're honest. Calvin's eyes softened. You're the first person who's asked me to choose honesty over comfort. Graham almost cried at the tenderness of that realization. Then the call came. Places! Marcel's voice echoed. The show began. In the audience, people laughed at jokes and held their breath through dramatic moments. Backstage, Graham and Calvin moved like they were carrying invisible pieces of the play on their shoulders. At one point, during a scene change, Calvin had to lift a section of the set while Graham held a brace in place. The set was heavier than it looked. Gravity turned teamwork into strain. Calvin's face tightened, and Graham felt Calvin's body shift with effort. Their hands locked under pressure. Graham heard Calvin's breath hitch. Then, as if his fear finally ran out of excuses, Calvin whispered, If we survive this, will you stay? Graham's heart slammed. He wanted to say yes in a way that promised forever, but Graham had learned something from Calvin's confession. Promises without truth were just another kind of lie. So Graham answered honestly, voice trembling, I'll stay while you keep telling the truth. Calvin nodded like that was the only vow he could handle. During the final act, Graham stepped out for a quick breath behind the curtain. Calvin followed close, holding his mic pack carefully. The applause from the audience sounded distant, like it was happening in another world. Calvin looked at Graham. I'm going to send it after, he said. Graham swallowed. Okay. Calvin's hands trembled slightly. I'm scared you'll change your mind. Graham's voice softened. If I change my mind, it won't be because you told me the truth. It'll be because you decide you can't do better. Calvin's eyes filled. I can do better, he whispered. When the curtain call ended, the audience's energy rushed into the lobby. People clapped, smiled, congratulated. But Graham couldn't feel any of it fully. His thoughts kept returning to the message Calvin needed to send. They found a quiet corner near the back exit where the air was cooler and the stage noise softened. Calvin pulled out his phone. Graham watched his fingers hover over the screen. For a moment, Graham thought Calvin might stall, might apologize for being honest, might retreat into the safe lie. Then Calvin's thumb pressed send. Graham felt his body react, like the moment had physically changed the atmosphere. Calvin put his phone down, hands shaking. Graham didn't ask what happened immediately. He didn't need to. He could see the truth in Calvin's face, a man waiting for consequences. A minute passed. Then Calvin's phone buzzed. Calvin stared at the screen like it was burning. Graham's chest tightened. What did he say? Calvin swallowed. He asked why I didn't tell him sooner. He's hurt. Graham's throat tightened. And? Calvin looked up. He also said he wants me to be happy. He wants me to stop pretending. Graham's eyes stung hard. That's not what you expected. Calvin let out a shaky exhale. No, I expected punishment. I expected the world to turn mean. Graham stepped closer and pressed his forehead to Calvin's. Honesty doesn't always make people cruel, Graham whispered. Calvin's voice broke. But I still feel like I'm falling. Graham kissed him then, quick and tender and not demanding. He kissed Calvin like he was telling him, I'm here, and you don't have to earn being loved by surviving alone. When they separated, Calvin's eyes were wet, but his smile was real. Behind them, the theater kept celebrating, but in that corner it felt like they had reached a different kind of ending, one where the love wasn't built on secrecy anymore. Later, after midnight had softened the streets and the last of the cast drifted home, Graham and Calvin walked to the car together. Graham tried to keep his voice steady. What happens now? Calvin opened the passenger door for Graham, but he didn't rush him. He waited until Graham was seated, then climbed in and closed the door. His hands rested on the steering wheel like he needed to anchor himself. We keep showing up, Calvin said. We fix what needs fixing. We tell the truth even when it makes us vulnerable. Graham stared ahead at the windshield. The headlights from other cars swept across his face in passing waves. What if it gets messy? Graham asked. Calvin looked at him. It will. Graham felt a tear finally spill. He didn't wipe it away immediately. He let it exist. Calvin reached over and wiped it gently with his thumb. But messy doesn't mean wrong, he said. Graham let out a shaky laugh that sounded like relief and fear arguing. Are you still, Graham began, then stopped. He didn't want labels. He didn't want the old stories. Calvin understood anyway. I'm still the man I've been trying to become, he said. The one who doesn't hide behind straight expectations. Graham turned his face toward Calvin. Then I'll stop hiding too. Calvin's smile trembled. I don't want you to hide. Graham's chest warmed. He leaned closer and kissed Calvin again, this time with the kind of courage that didn't need applause. When they pulled away, they stayed close, foreheads touching. The car idled softly in the quiet parking lot. The theater lights behind them were off now, curtains fully closed. And still, Graham felt the story continuing, tender and honest, not perfect yet, but real. Tonight changed everything, Graham whispered. Calvin nodded, eyes soft. And tomorrow, he said, voice steady, we keep the promise we just made.